You're live. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. As you know, I jump around topics based on the calendar and what else is going on. This coming week, the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, the day picked by the United Nations and international organizations, January 27th, next Monday, I think it is, to commemorate the Holocaust on a global scale. But right now, this week, there is a huge Holocaust conference in Israel with many international leaders that are there. Very important symbolic gestures, many speeches being made. It is a very important time. And I wanted to talk about anti-Semitism, basically the cause of the Holocaust in and of itself. World War II was caused by a lot more than just this, but the Holocaust was caused by anti-Semitism. If you've been paying attention to the news, you may have noticed that anti-Semitism has been having a bit of a resurgence. It's been cool to be anti-Semitic again. But not all types of anti-Semitism are the same. We use the term anti-Semitism, and we talk about anti-Semitism like it's all just one big thing. But there are pieces of anti-Semitism, each are bad, but they're bad for different reasons, and they need to be responded to in different ways. And we have to be careful of them in different ways. So it's a complicated phenomenon. It's not just a very simple thing. It has more pieces to it than most other forms of hate that are out there. And that makes it harder to deal with. And it also makes it something that we need to understand. For those of you who are planning to convert, I also like to make sure that anti-Semitism is near the beginning of the course. Not to scare you away, but to make sure that you have an honest understanding that if you become Jewish, there are going to be millions of people who like you a whole lot less. It is something that I have no control over, but it is something that you should understand because, as I've said before, you can be a good person, you can be right with God without being Jewish, and then you don't get the hate. So you have to really want to be Jewish when you know what you're going to have to be putting up with. Well, I know, but as the teacher, I have to make sure the students understand what they're signing up for. and I know that all of my students, no one yet has ever said, whoa, I'm out of here. But I would feel wrong if I didn't explain what they face. All right, so we're going to talk about why the anti-Semitism. We're not going to talk, the statistics and the fact that Judaism is the #1 victim of hate crimes for religious basis in America. More than half of all hate crimes in the United States are perpetrated against religiously motivated hate crimes are perpetrated against Jews, even though we are like 1% of the population. So we're not going to go into the statistics or the fact that there's been a resurgence, although it's actually been interesting. The resurgence has been marked by more deaths, but fewer attacks. That is to say, we have had a few very painful years where there have been mass shootings and deaths of many people at once. But the actual number of attacks has still been going down since the FBI began keeping the national records for this. So things are getting better while still being worse. We're burying more people, but it's happening with less frequency. And the attacks are more, there's more vandalism rather than assault than there used to be. So a little bit less personal violence, more property violence in proportion to the number of attacks. And the total number of attacks is still not where we want it to be, but it's nothing like what it used to be in the past. So as bad as it is, and as the fact that it's getting a little worse recently should make us very upset and cautious, it's still better than it was for most of the last 2,000 years, which is what we're going to see. So anti-Semitism basically comes in 3 varieties plus 1. That is to say, there is cultural anti-Semitism, there is theological anti-Semitism, and there is racial anti-Semitism. There is hating Jews because of our culture, there is hating Jews because of our religion, and there is hating Jews because of our race. And we're going to get into that race thing a lot because Judaism is not a race, but many people who hate Jews treat us like a race. And we'll talk about that in more detail. Anti-Israelism is kind of a, new issue because since the reestablishment of Israel and the beginning of Zionism in the late 1800s, and then into obviously the 20th century, there has been a expression of anti-Semitism that is wrapped as being anti-Israel. Now, of course, you can criticize Israel if you like. There's nothing wrong with that. Go to Israel. Every Israeli criticizes their own country. That's what it is to be Israeli. It's what it is to be American too. We criticize our government too. We say that we're not doing this right, that right, whatever. Same thing applies in Israel. It becomes anti-Semitism, and it is rooted in one of these other three when somebody is criticizing Israel in a way that is either incorrect or is held to a double standard. That is to say, it's okay for these people to do this, but Israel can't because they're evil. Or if it is then enacting inappropriate responses. Because I don't like what Israel did, I am now going to blow them up. Usually that is implying that there is a different level of hate rather than a criticism of a government's policy. Usually it's involving denying the right to exist, and of course doing so on a double standard, since other countries are not regularly denied the right to exist. But we're going to focus mainly on the first three: cultural, theological, and racial. We're good? Good. So cultural anti-Semitism is probably, and the history is a little fuzzy because we don't have good records, is probably the earliest form of anti-Semitism. This type of anti-Semitism attacks Judaism as a way of life that is either inferior or actually corrosive to its adherents and the general society. So these are people who say the way Jews live is bad for everyone around them or is bad for the Jews. The charges can be that we are lazy. The famous example from the ancient world was Shabbat. The Greeks came and said, what do you mean you don't work one day out of the week? That means you're wasting 1/7 of your life. What kind of lazy people are you? I don't know what they would think about modern society where people have 2-day weekends, but that was one of the things they claimed. They also have legalistic, they also claim that we are too legalistic or too argumentative, right? Jews are always arguing about law. They're always trying to, find the case for this, the case for that. It's not enough spirit. It's just, too argumentative. Or sometimes they're just angry because we are divisive and we're different, right? If their culture is like this and our culture is like that, that can make some people angry just because we're different. And because we refuse to stop being different. That can cause lots of problems. And these attacks have been around since before the Common Era, since before year 0. If we go back to Manetho, who was an Egyptian priest, he lived in the 3rd century BCE, and he wrote that the Hebrews, his description of us, the Israelites, were expelled Egyptian lepers. They said, no, they weren't actually a separate group. These were people that Egypt didn't want. Right? And we pushed them out of the land of Egypt. No exodus. It was them kicking us out. And they did it because we had been taught by Moses not to adore the gods. Right? So we were our own corrupt little group and they were pushing us out. Now, obviously, he's making this up. But this is an example of that kind of cultural anti-Semitism. We were different. We were wrong. We were dirty because we were lepers or whatever. And therefore, that's why we were gotten rid of. The Roman writers also generally don't speak so well of the Jews. Now, this is partly because of our rejection of Hellenistic culture, right? We did not embrace what the Greeks taught like the way the Romans did. We did not embrace what the Romans brought to us either. But it was mostly because of our continued efforts to break free of the empire. Jews were rebellious. We did not like Roman rule. We constantly had revolutions and uprisings against Rome. Ultimately, which led to the full diaspora of the Jewish people around the world. And every time they beat us, they would celebrate it with special coins and special statues. You can still go to Rome and see the Ark of Titus, for example. You can see the Colosseum, which was built with gold taken from the Jews when they destroyed the temple. We paid for the Colosseum in more than just gold, also our blood. That was outsized. I mean, okay, fine. If they're fighting Carthage, if they're fighting Gaul, these massive states with huge armies, we understand why they want to celebrate their victory. But we were a tiny little speck on the coast of the Mediterranean, but we caused so much trouble and we fought so hard that they developed quite an angry attitude towards us. And that angry attitude goes into their writing. But cultural anti-Semitism is not only from the past, it continues now. And in the Enlightenment, this became even more dangerous. So the Enlightenment, as you may know, is that period from around the 1600s up until the 1800s, when people who were coming up with the ideas that would lead to the Declaration of Independence, the rights of man, John Locke, John Mill, all of these great thinkers who were talking about human condition and rights and freedoms and liberty, you would think this would be a great time for the Jewish people. But this actually was a time where the differences in our cultures and the differences in our people was highlighted. Because as the Europeans were figuring out what they were, they noticed that we were different, right? So as if you have a group of kids in the room and there's a teacher in the front of the room, all the kids are students and the teacher's the teacher. If the teacher leaves, those students are going to suddenly break into their own little cliques. They're not going to be all students. Now they're going to be jocks, and they're going to be cheerleaders, and they're going to be the nerds, and they're going to break into their own little groups and then define who they are, and they're not going to like the other ones across the way. Throughout the European history, when there were kings, the kings were in charge and everyone else was under them. And so there wasn't exactly equality, far from it, but people were subject to the will of the king. When they began to say, maybe the king shouldn't have so much power, maybe we should be British, maybe we should be French, maybe we should be German, not just under a king, they had to define what it meant to be French. What does it mean to be British? What does it mean to be German? And as they came up with those definitions, we generally didn't fit the definition. We didn't always dress the same. We didn't always speak the same languages, or at least not always the same way. We certainly didn't have the same way of worshiping. We had our own ideas about families and marriages and all of those. And they sort of were going, you don't really fit in around here, do you? And so I'll read you a couple examples from people who were dealing with the Jewish question in Europe at this time. So the first quote, does the law of Moses, Torah, make citizenship and full integration of the Jew into other peoples difficult or impossible? Notice the two choices. It's either hard or impossible. Okay, those are my two choices. Well, I think it does. The purpose of this law, the purpose of this Torah, he says, is to maintain the Jews as a people almost completely separate from other peoples. And this purpose is an integral part of all the laws, down to those concerning kosher, and with the result that the Jews have lived as a separate group during the 70 years of dispersion. So Johann's argument here is that if you try and let the Jews be a member of your community, a member of your state, is that the bell? Yes, they can't be. Because how could they be a member if their law keeps them apart, if their culture keeps them separate? I mean, I give you citizenship, but you're not going to eat my pork. And I give you citizenship, but you're not going to marry my family. I give you citizenship, but you're not going to come to my church. You don't fit in because your laws keep you from fitting in. Now, although he's talking about the law of Moses, but he's actually talking about cultural markers more than anything else, because anybody who lives in the United States knows that it is perfectly possible for a Jew of even the strictest observance to be able to be part of American culture. I mean, sure, I'm not going to go to McDonald's and have a Big Mac, but I can still go to a baseball game. I can still participate in elections. I can still serve on a jury. I still can be involved in business and commerce and go to the same movie theater, gas stations, supermarkets as everyone else. So this idea that somehow our culture forces us to be separate is not really a logical analysis of the situation. It is based off a feeling that we are different and now looking for an excuse of why we are to blame for that. As though the 1700 years of our separation was entirely our choice. As though, 2,000 years ago, we said, all right, we're all going to move to Europe, but we're not going to be European. No, we moved to Europe because it was a better place to live than where we had been living. We tried to fit in within the extent, of course, of Jewish law, but within the extent of Jewish law, we fit in very well if they let us. So the barrier was not us, the barrier was them. But, of course, in the normal way of oppression, the person who's doing the oppressing has to blame the victim. Otherwise, they feel like bad guys. So, similar quote, this time from somebody who was on our side. Christian Wilhelm von Dohm was actually trying to help the Jews in his own way. As you can see, not exactly the best friend. And we're talking again about whether or not Jews could be part of society. He says, impartiality would demand that if a Jewish and Christian applicant show equal capability, two people come for a job, the latter, the Christian, deserves preference. Right? Obvious. This seems to be an obvious right of the majority in the nation. Right? So first of all, notice that somebody who was enlightened in 1780, same time American revolutions happened and all of that, says, look, if there are two people who come and one is part of the majority of my country and one is a minority of my country, of course I'm going to like the majority person better, because that's just normal and fair. Nowadays we would say, no, that's not fair. But it's okay, because he offers us a choice, at least until the Jews, by wiser treatment, are changed into entirely equal citizens and all differences polished off. As soon as Jews don't look different than anyone else, don't act different than anyone else, don't think different than anyone else, then fine, then you're one of us, and now I'll treat you equally. Right? That was his deal. Right? For all these reasons, and trusting that human nature is the same in all people, which is nice, he does consider us human, I am convinced that in a few generations, the Jews will be just like all other citizens in those states, which will give them equal rights. So his great idea was, you make Jews equal, and they'll stop being Jews. Or at the very least, they'll stop being Jewish. Maybe they still talk about Moses and they still talk about, God in a different way than the Christians do. The same way that Protestants are different than Catholics and different parts of Protestants are different than other parts of Protestants. But you wouldn't really know that they were different. And that was his hope, that eventually the Jewish culture would just disappear and then everything would be great. So as you can see, there is a latent anger or hatred towards what Jews do. And these people are saying Jews would be okay as long as they stop doing it. Now, like I said, that's different than the theological anti-Semitism, and that's much different than the racial anti-Semitism that we'll talk about. But we got the basic idea here? Okay. So let's talk about theological anti-Semitism. This is when religions go bad. So in the ancient world, right, back before Christianity, before Islam, when it was just Judaism going around saying there's only one God, Judaism's monotheism was at odds with the pagan pantheons. Obviously, the Greeks did not like us telling them that we thought their gods weren't real. Of course, that doesn't exactly make people happy. But it was also normal for different religions and groups to argue about whose God was better than whose God. So there wasn't as much hatred just from this uniquely directed at Jews. It wasn't until later, under Christianity and then Islam, that you have built-in reasons within the religion for disliking Judaism and Jews by extension. Under Christianity, both Catholicism and Protestantism, although Catholicism has had a longer history, there was anger at the Jews' refusal to accept Jesus. Right? Of course, we've talked about the idea of, as we're going to see, about blaming Jews for the crucifixion, but let's get one thing very clear. Christians have been angry at us for 2,000 years because we didn't sign up. When Jesus came and when there was all of the beginning of Christianity and the Jews said, no, thank you, that was an incredible insult and an incredible problem for the early Christian missionaries. Because if the Jews didn't want to join your religion, why should anyone else? Because after all, Christianity came out of Judaism. So if the people who gave it birth didn't want anything to do with it, why would some Roman person, some Egyptian person, some Persian person, why would they want to have anything to do with it? And so there was a great deal of anger towards us for just simply refusing to accept Jesus and to join in with Christianity. It was also necessary to be angry at us to justify the new faith as being a replacement for the old, the so-called supersessionist theology. Christianity has at its core the idea that there is a new covenant. Right? There was the covenant between God and the Israelites, and that covenant got canceled, according to the Christians, and replaced by a new covenant that involves Jesus. Well, if I'm selling that to other people, I have to make it very clear that the old covenant is wrong, and the people who belong to the old covenant are going to be punished for not on the new version. And so therefore, theologically, the Christians had to say, yeah, we believe in the Bible, we believe in Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus and all of that, but the people it talks about, the Hebrews, the Israelites, they don't count anymore. They're no longer the chosen people. They're no longer special. They no longer have a relationship with God. We have taken over for them, right? We are the sequel and the replacement. That becomes necessary if you're going to justify being Christian and nothing else. As soon as you try to say that you need to be Christian exclusively and no other religion is valid anymore, then Judaism becomes the biggest problem. It's easy to say that, the people worshiping rocks are wrong, and the people worshiping Zeus are wrong, and the people worshiping, people around the world are wrong. But the Jews, they're using our book to justify their religion. So they are especially interested in proving us wrong and saying that we are bad, because otherwise, why should I join the Christians? I can just be Jewish instead. Make sense? Okay. And of course, Jews became the focus of blame for the crucifixion when people say that we killed Jesus, when missionaries were seeking favor with the Roman Empire. If you want to go to Rome, it doesn't sell well if you say the Romans murdered your God. You kind of have to blame someone else for that. And blaming the Jews, which, if you remember, were already not exactly the favorite people in Rome because we had already had so many revolutions and problems with Rome. Blaming us, the Romans went, oh yeah, the Jews, they're a problem, absolutely. So it made it a much easier deal if they were focusing on us as being the people to blame for the crucifixion. Now, the same thing basically happens when it comes to the Quran and when it comes to Muhammad. Muhammad first came and he said to the Jews, you guys are so brave, you're so wonderful, it's great that you have been keeping to your ways. Of course the Christians are wrong, of course all pagans were wrong and all the idol worshippers were wrong, but it's okay, we've now got the new version called the Quran, and now you've held out long enough, you can join us and we will bring God to the world. And we said, well, it's great that you want to have one God, it's great that you have your own religion, but that's not ours, right? We're going to keep our relationship with God as the Torah has told us. Muhammad and the Muslims that came afterwards were not very happy about that. Different times we've had different relationships with Muslim empires, but religiously, there is still a bit of an issue in most forms of Islam with Judaism existing without as being a binding book of religion upon ourselves. Okay. St. Augustine is in fact one of the earliest people who explained not only why they needed to hate the Jews, but how much to hate us, because they wanted to get the balance just right. And it admits and it vows the Jewish people to be cursed, because after killing Christ, they continued to till the ground of an earthly circumcision and an earthly Sabbath, an earthly Passover, the hidden strength or virtue of making known Christ. Okay, what in the world is he saying? All right, so this is what happens when you translate something from 1700 years ago. All right, what St. Augustine is saying is, look, the Jews are cursed by God because they killed Jesus. And even worse than that, they still do all of these laws. They still follow all of these commandments that are on earth. They do an earthly circumcision. The Christians believed in a spiritual circumcision, a circumcision of the heart, not a circumcision of the flesh. We were still doing the flesh, and that was a problem. We believe in an earthly Sabbath, right? We keep Shabbat. More about that in the later class. And we keep Shabbat in a very physical way. We light candles, we do Kiddush, we rest from our work. It's a very physical activity. And the early Christian thinkers believed that Shabbat should be a purely spiritual belief. Same thing with Passover. We're still doing matzah. We're still doing, well, not at this point, we weren't doing the sacrifices, but we believed that they were still valid. If they could be done, we still are eating, we're still retelling, we're still doing Passover physically, and that seemed wrong to them. All of this, remember, had been replaced by Jesus. And so therefore, for us to do it implied that we didn't accept that Jesus had died so that we didn't have to do it anymore. Right? So every time we circumcise a new boy, it's like we're poking a finger in Jesus and saying, we don't believe, we don't believe, we don't believe. And St. Augustine and other early Christians were rather angry about that. The Jewish people, like Cain, continue tilling the ground in the carnal observance of the law, carnal meaning the physical law, which does not yield them its strength because they do not perceive in it the grace of Christ. Remember, Christianity believes very much that it is about believing that Jesus died for you that makes everything actually happen. The idea that you can do this with your own hands, with your own works, with your own compliance with God, that just doesn't work. Because if it did work, you wouldn't need Christianity. And so therefore, when we do it, acting like we believe it works, which we do, we are rejecting Christianity. And so Christianity has to reject us in return. And that is a fundamental truth of the nature of these two religions. They can't both be 100% accurate and coexist in 100% of the way. We can talk about that in more detail another time if you like. Judaism, since Christ, is a corruption. Indeed, Judas is the image of the Jewish people. Their understanding of scripture is carnal, physical. They bear the guilt for the death of the Savior, for through their fathers they have killed Christ. So we are all guilty because our ancestors did it. So even though this is hundreds of years after Jesus, St. Augustine says we are still cursed because we still keep the Torah and because we are the descendants of the people who caused the crucifixion. It's hard to get around this, right? And for a couple thousand years, the Catholic Church didn't. That is to say, the Catholic Church, and then later Protestantism as well, firmly believes that theologically, Jews are damned to hell. But more than that, because they believe lots of people are damned to hell, they believe that we have a special place in hell because we are the people who should have accepted Jesus. We are the people who did kill Jesus. We are the people who make a mockery of the grace and all these other things. And therefore, not only were we cursed, but we had to suffer so that everyone else would know. St. Augustine goes on to say that we ended up being an example to everyone else. This isn't his quote. This is from a more modern text to make sure that you understand this is still going on. This is from October 2010 from the Special Synod of the Bishops for the Middle East from Protestant movement. It says, we Christians cannot speak of the promised land as an exclusive right for a privileged Jewish people. This promise was nullified by Christ. In the kingdom of God, there is no longer a chosen people. What they're saying is the Jews have no claim to Israel because when Jesus came, everybody was made equal, and therefore Jews don't get to claim that they have any right to the land, right? Our promise, our covenant was canceled by Jesus, and therefore nothing special about being Jewish. Obviously, we disagree. But they're using their theology to deny us the right, in this particular case, the right to exist peacefully in our own country. So yeah, it's still going on. It's dressed up in nicer language. They're not talking about being cursed and all of that. But the basic underlying theological challenge is if Judaism is right, even a little, then Christianity is considered to be weaker for most forms of Christianity. There are some forms of Christianity that have adapted and come to different ways, and there have some forms of Christianity that have not changed their theology, but have at least changed their the way they implement it. So from the middle of the 20th century onward, the Catholic Church has formally said they are not trying to convert the Jews. And they have formally said that we are not responsible for the death of Jesus. That is earth-shattering from history, right? For the Catholic Church to finally say that we should not be blamed for the death of Jesus, and for the Catholic Church to say the Jews don't have to convert and become Catholic, was earth-shattering when it finally happened. And it is a huge step, and it has made the relationships between Jews and many of their Catholic neighbors worlds better than it had ever been before in our history. However, the Pope still says that the fact that Jews are not to be converted, and the fact that the Catholic Church is still the only way to get to heaven, the fact that both those statements are true is a divine mystery. Basically, he can't explain it. He can't reconcile it with the doctrine. But he isn't going to say, therefore convert the Jews or therefore hate the Jews. He wants to change it, which is good. I mean, and like I said, this was done back under the Vatican Council, but it is still a tension with Catholic belief. And many Protestant denominations will also say that they embrace Judaism, that they like Judaism, that they think Judaism is great. But Jews should still become Christian. Jews should still, worship Jesus. Jews should still leave behind. There is still a theological tension behind that. But different groups will respond to it differently. Some will do it with understanding and say, you know what? I don't agree with what you're doing, but I'm not going to hate you because you're different, and I'm not going to punish you for it. And others have a different respect. And the same thing happens in the Muslim world. There are many fine Muslims in Orlando that I've met that, yes, they still think that Islam is the correct religion, but they are respectful and tolerant of people who practice differently, the same way that I am respectful and tolerant of people who practice differently. So just because there are theological differences doesn't mean there has to be hate, which is why the hatred that is built out of theology is still a choice. Just like the hatred that is built out of culture is still a choice. Just because two cultures are different doesn't mean they have to hate one another. Just because two religions are different doesn't mean they have to hate one another. So although these are the grounding of anti-Semitism, they're not the actual causes of the anti-Semitism. They are the excuse of anti-Semitism. It is the cover story for anti-Semitism. Right? Hate is always a choice. And how you describe your hate is your choice too. You can describe it in culture, you can describe it in religion, you can describe it in race. So let's talk about race. Oh, actually, hold on. Sorry, I forgot there was one little thing, just a little bit of history. One thing that came out of the religious anti-Semitism, theological anti-Semitism, was something called the blood libel. This is a term that is still used quite a lot. Luckily, it's not used so much in its original sense, but it is a false accusation about us as being murderers. The idea is that somehow the Jews used the blood of non-Jews for various rituals, rites, or practices. Now, as you all know, blood is like the last thing that Jews want anywhere around them, right? It doesn't mean we don't want to be doctors, but it does mean when it comes to like our rituals and such, we don't like blood, right? We can't eat meat if the blood is still in it. We can't eat blood by itself as a food, unlike some other cultures and cuisines around the world do. It's very much against Jewish law for us to be eating blood. But this lie has been going on for a long time, all the way back to Democritus in 460 to 370 BCE. He believed that every 7 years, the Jews captured a stranger, brought him to the temple in Jerusalem, and sacrificed him, cutting his flesh into bits. Now, of course we didn't, but this was the kind of slander that went around the ancient world. It wasn't only against us. People said the Greeks said horrible things about the Persians said horrible things about the Greeks. That's not so unusual. Appian, however, also believed that we sacrificed our captives during the Maccabean Wars. But where this really became a problem was in the Middle Ages in Europe. In 1144, the Jewish community of Norwich in England was accused of ritually murdering the boy William of Norwich, who is now considered a saint in many traditions. Thomas Monmouth claimed that an international group of Jews had to kill a child in order to return us to Israel. Sound familiar? The idea that there's this international group of Jews that are secretly working together to do whatever evil plan we have. This idea is still here in the modern world. Right? You can talk to people and look at the evil George Soros. Now, why are they picking on George Soros? Not just because of his politics, but because he's a Jew, and the idea that there is a secret Jewish group that is trying to take over the world or do horrible things is very much still alive and well. If you remember the Pittsburgh shooter at the Tree of Life Synagogue, one of the theories that he was ranting about was the idea that Jews were secretly trying to replace the white race by bringing in immigrants to America that were not white, so that we would change the American color and we would change the race of America. Again, he believed this was a secret Jewish conspiracy. This has been going on for a very, very long time, and it happened over and over and over again throughout the Middle Ages. It's one of the reasons why Jews were always very cautious around the time of Passover, because the belief was that we were making matzah out of the blood of these children. And so around Passover, we got worried that random villages would suddenly come and attack us, because if a kid went missing, we'd get blamed, even though, obviously we were not doing this. So if you hear blood libel, this is a little bit of its history. Well, let's talk about racial anti-Semitism. So racial anti-Semitism is the newest form of anti-Semitism. As I mentioned in my sermon last Shabbat, racism itself is very new. You may notice that the early people who we read through, the Greeks, the Romans, St. Augustine, all the others, they were not talking about Jews as being a race. They were talking about us as having a culture, having a religion, having our own ways, but no one said anything about our DNA. DNA is a new invention, right? We hadn't discovered DNA until very recently. But with the rise of modern biology and misapplied Darwinism, right, the idea of survival of the fittest, the idea of hereditary breeding to create a superior species, which is what people do when they're breeding dogs in order to try and make the purebreds, what people do with horses, what people do with plants. This idea led many modern thinkers to use race as an excuse to despise Jews. And this has become especially problematic because unlike earlier forms of anti-Semitism, a Jew had no hope of escaping these charges. Right? If someone says, I don't like the fact that you keep kosher, I could stop keeping kosher, and then maybe they would like me. If someone says, I don't like you because you worship Judaism and Judaism killed my God, okay, I can become Christian, I can become Muslim, and now you don't hate me. And indeed, for a few thousand years, many Jews would simply leave Judaism and they would blend into the general culture around them, they would assimilate, and they would disappear as Jews and they would no longer be hated. It was an effective way of escaping the hate that happened around us. Racial anti-Semitism has no escape, because if it's in blood, if it's in your genes, and then you stop doing it, it's still there. And therefore, the racial anti-Semites have become the most dangerous form of anti-Semites that we still face, right? No conversion, no renunciation of people can change your racial type. If you want to make sure you see this very clearly, if somebody was born African-American and they were being attacked by white people, and they said, look, I'll stop being African-American, would the KKK accept that? No. How can you stop, right? You can't change who you are. You can't change your genes. Therefore, we can hate you no matter what you do. Right? You can talk like us. You can dress like us. You can act like us. You can worship like us. You can do everything like us. But if we think your genes are wrong, we can hate you forever. Right? This is the most form of hate that exists. And it's why racial hatred is also such a terrible, terrible problem in the world today. But like I said, historically, we didn't have to face this as Jews. This was a very new idea that only came around in the late 1800s. And then, of course, in the 1900s became very, very popular. So who, of course, made this the most famous form of Jewish hatred? Adolf Hitler. All right, so this is in an interview with a newspaper, a quote from Hitler. So Gobineau and Chamberlain were inspired by our concept of a new order, a new order, I tell you, or if you prefer, an ideological glimpse into history in accordance with the basic principle of blood. And when he means blood, he means ancestry, the body, the stock of the people. We do not judge by merely artistic or military standards, or even by purely scientific ones. We judge by the spiritual energy which a people is capable of putting forth, which will enable it in 10 years to recapture what it has lost in 1,000 years of warfare. So what is Adolf Hitler trying to say here? I hate trying to explain Hitler, but it's important to understand the people who continue to think like him. What he's trying to say is, I don't care what you've done for art. I don't care about your military ability. And remember, being strong in the military was considered a great thing back then. You know, you're good with a sword, good with a rifle, you must be a worthwhile person. I don't care even if you're a scientific person. You've invented this, you've invented that, you've cured this, you've cured. That doesn't matter. What matters is the energy in your body, your spiritual energy. And that is determined by blood. That isn't determined by you, that's determined by birth. According to him, you are what you were born. And if you're born with faulty spiritual energy, then that's a problem. If you're born with good spiritual energy, which is what he thought the Germans had, then even if there was a problem, in 10 years, they could come back from this, which of course is what Hitler was trying to do, was to rebuild Germany after World War I. I intend to set up a 1,000-year Reich, right? That there would be a reign of the German Empire for 1,000 years. And anyone who supports me in battle is a fellow fighter for a unique spiritual, I would almost say divine creation. This is not only being racial, but as being almost what God wants from the world. At the decisive moment, the decisive factor was not the ratio of strength, but the spiritual force employed. Notice that this is inescapable if you are one of his enemies. You can't join him. You can't say, okay, we surrender, because you're still a poison. So if your race is the wrong race, then you are condemned forever. In Mein Kampf, in Hitler's main book, right, the Jew has always been a people with definite racial characteristics and never a religion. Just let that sink in for a second. Right? We're not a religion, we're a race. This is the way he looked at Jews. Only in order to get ahead, he early sought for a means which could distract unpleasant attention from his person. Basically, Jews pretend to be a religion because they know that people don't like our race. And so if we pretend to be a religion, then somehow this is going to make things better. And what would have been more expedient, at the same time more innocent, than the embezzled concept of a religious community? For here, too, everything is borrowed, or rather stolen. We didn't make anything, we didn't create anything. We stole the idea of religion as a mask that we could use to sneak into other societies, because we were really this evil race, and if people saw us for what we were, then they would have killed us long. This is what he really believed, right? That it was in our blood, in our very being, and that everything we did, no matter how good it looked, no matter how innocent it looked, was all evil. It's a very twisted way to look at the world. Due to his own original special nature, the Jew cannot possess a religious institution. Right? We are incapable of having religion. We are incapable of having anything be spiritual, if for no other reason, because he lacks idealism in any form, and hence belief in a hereafter is absolutely foreign to him. Now, I'm sorry, but most Jews I know are very idealistic. Most Jews I know very much believe in a olam haba, in a world to come, in what you might call heaven. We absolutely believe in an afterlife. And a religion in the Aryan sense, the Nazi way, cannot be imagined, which lacks the conviction of after death in some form. Of course, you have to believe in life after death, blah, 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 blah. Obviously, this whole book goes on to espouse such horrible things, but just one more thing that we need to see, which is going to sound remarkably familiar. It is true we Germans are barbarians. That is an honored title to us. I free humanity from the shackles of the soul, from the degrading suffering caused by the false visions called conscience and ethics. The Jews have inflicted two wounds on mankind: circumcision on its body, see, again, they really don't like circumcision, and conscience on its soul. They are Jewish inventions. The war for the domination of the world is waged only between these two camps alone, the Germans and the Jews. Everything else is but deception. You have to admit, he is a very powerful writer. There's a reason why a lot of people fell for this. But think of what he is saying here. First of all, as such a false understanding of Judaism. He is basically saying that Judaism has corrupted the world by tricking it into having circumcision, which it's not like we go around making other people get circumcised. But anyway, that really seemed to bug him. But more importantly, that we tricked it into having a conscience. Because what is the true and right way for a man to live? To be a barbarian. Right? That is the proper way to live. Right? What is a barbarian? A barbarian is somebody who lives by their strength. Right? The strong becomes the chief, and the weak become the peasants. Right? And the stronger you are, the more you get, the more you do, the more you have. And what did Jews do? We tricked the human race into giving up their strength and having a conscience instead. To make them think about the weak, to make them think about the poor, to make them not use their power to dominate, but instead to, have a nice society. Woo!
What just happened? I'm sorry, I have no idea.
Breaking news?
I don't know what this is.
Right
now. Oh, come on.
It's okay, it's okay. Technology can be very pushy.
Yeah, oh my.
We're good. So, it just wanted to break in. So this was his basic idea, where that Judaism had tricked the world into having a conscience, because if it hadn't, then the world would have destroyed us. We had to trick the mighty to be nice to us by fooling them into thinking that being nice was good, that being kind was good. Because those ideals are ideals, right? The ideal should be for this master race goes on to talk about. But we poisoned this idea, but more than poisoning it as an idea, we are the only opponent because it is racial, right? We are a race that is the exact opposite of the Aryans in his idea, right? The idea of the barbarian and the non-barbarian. And we are racially the non-barbarian. Yeah. It's rough stuff. And unfortunately, there are people who still believe this. Not everybody still believes this in a religious way. Not everyone still believes this in a racial way, but there are still people out there who believe that altruism is bad, that being nice is wrong, that helping others is wrong, that the strong should survive, that we don't need protection for the weak, that if they're weak, they deserve to be taken advantage of. I'm sorry, it's my turn to make noise. Let me just turn that off. And this continues to go on.
So he said nothing about the British or the French or Canadians. The war is just between the Germans. We're going to control the world.
Everything else was a distraction.
Oh.
All right, so although I said at the beginning that World War II was fought for many reasons, for the Germans, as far as Hitler was concerned, World War II was fought for one reason: to get rid of the Jew. Right? If he was able to get rid of all the Jews, but Germany had lost, he would have been okay with that. Right? His main goal was to eradicate Judaism. And to understand this, it begins to give you much more insight into why he did what he did. Right? Why invade Poland? Because that's where most of the Jews were living in Europe at the time. Why invade the Soviet Union that he had surprisingly been able to make a peace deal with? Rather than going into the Middle East and taking the oil fields there, why invade Soviet Union? Because that's the largest population of Jews. Why, as his own army was crumbling and as the Allies were advancing, did he continue to divert trainloads full of troops and make them wait until trains going to the death camps would go past? Because the purpose of the war for Hitler was to kill the Jew. So even as he was losing, he was still trying to kill more of us. Otherwise, if you're losing, you would just say, all right, fine, we've lost, and you just open up the camps and kick us out. That wasn't his purpose. His purpose was to kill the Jew. Because in his mind, that was the great battle. It was the cosmic battle between the noble barbarian and the horrible Jew that was trying to give him a soul, that was trying to give him a conscience. I know, it's pretty messed up, right? So there is no Jewish race. Let me just make sure I say that again and again and again. There is no such thing as a Jewish race. It's difficult to pin down race genetically, even outside of Judaism. But people may talk about an African American race or a Chinese race or whatever, but even those races are not like something that is clear. Like there's one little DNA marker that labels you as Chinese. They're clusters of different body features and the way your face looks and your skin pigment. It's an entire spectrum blended together, and the edges are absolutely overlapping and blurry. And you will find people of the same skin color all around the world. They're not clustered just in one little spot. But in Judaism in particular, it is stupid to talk about race, because there are Jews, and there have been Jews for thousands of years with different racial markings, whether it be the shape of our face, the color of our skin, the type of our hair. That has been diverse all the way since back at the beginning. So to call us a race in any meaningful way is totally ridiculous. Right? The genetic race, idea of race is difficult, but Judaism has come. Judaism is still a very diverse, and the very, very fact that a person can convert to Judaism shows that it's not a race. Like I said at the very beginning when we were talking about race, if the African American said to the KKK, I want to convert to being a white person, it doesn't work. But if someone says, I want to convert to being Jewish, of course it can work. And we don't check what your race is before we let someone become Jewish. Right? There are Jews who join Judaism of all different types of racial ethnicities and of different backgrounds. Okay, so anti-Semitism may be explained culturally or religiously or racially, but really it is incredibly flexible. In 1890 to 1990, since capitalism is fighting against communism, many people will say Jews are communists. And from the 1800s to the modern day, because communist theories are fighting against capitalists, many people will say Jews are capitalists. And if you were to go back to the Soviet Union in the 1930s, people were saying Jews are terrible because they're all capitalists. And if you were to go to New York in the 1930s, they would say Jews are terrible because they're all communists. Whatever was your enemy, you claimed that's what the Jew was doing. Anti-Semitism is very flexible. It will fit over any hate you want. 1960s to modern day, there was fighting against the civil rights abuses, so therefore Jews must be racist. And there were also people who were saying in 1960 to modern day that since people wanted to stop civil rights from being given, that they said, therefore Jews are trying to destroy our race. Like I said, the Pittsburgh shooter in the Tree of Life was very much someone who hated civil rights. And so he, of course, thought that Jews were on the wrong side of that battle. And so we were his target. 2007 to the modern day, more recently, the world faced collapse in the economic system. And guess what? They believed the Jews were responsible for that. The Jews caused and control the world. And I haven't updated this, but in 2018, there has been a great deal of chatter in the world of the internet that for people that are supporters of President Trump, they say the Jews are the ones trying to impeach him. Right? They specifically signal out the Jews as being the ones causing the impeachment. And for people who are against President Trump, the people say the Jews are the ones who keep trying to cover up President Trump's crimes, or the Jews are the ones who are behind his crimes and he's just their puppet. So you can't win. Quite literally, you can't win. Anti-Semitism is a chameleon. It will take on different forms and different styles because there is something vaguely unsettling about us to everyone. And that is the fact that we are willing to be ourselves and not just be like other people. We're willing to have our own culture and not change yours and not be antagonistic to your culture, right? If you are being a just and fine society, we're not asking you to be like us. That's weird. And religiously, our religion calls into question most other forms of religion on the planet, of whether or not it's really necessary to believe in Jesus, to follow the Quran, or do the other things. And for religions out there that are trying to be exclusive, we are the only path, like Islam and Christianity. For us to say, well, no, you're not, that's a problem. That is going to cause some problem. And for those that believe in a racial stereotype of the world, then of course we are going to be a problem, not because we're a race, but because we're just going to say no. No, that's not right. We have never fit neatly into anyone else's mold. We've never fit neatly into other people's framework of understanding the world. And we've always made them question what they think they know. We've always made them think, well, you know, the Jews are doing that. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe what we're doing is wrong. Maybe I don't need to do what I'm doing. And when people begin to question themselves, they are angry at the thing that made them do that. That's a general life rule. And you may have encountered people in your life that nothing about Judaism, that maybe you're angry when they're talking to you and you think, why are you getting angry at me? What did I do? Well, you didn't do anything directly, but something about you made them wonder about themselves. And when they wondered about themselves, they didn't like what they saw. And when they didn't like what they saw, they didn't change themselves. They got angry at the thing that made them think about themselves. And Jews have been very good at making people think. We've been very good at asking annoying questions. We've been very good at comedy for that exact reason. For that enough, people get sick and tired of being told, maybe you should think about what you're doing. And then they come and find excuses to hate us for reasons other than just we're asking them to try and be better. So we're going to leave it here for tonight because I am out of time. I have another meeting to run off to. There's obviously much, much more history of anti-Semitism, and there's much more in the psychology of the anti-Semite. And like I said, there are many different types of anti-Semites. We didn't really get into the types that are anti-Israel. Maybe I'll squeeze that into another class at another time. But understand that this is something, as bizarre as it is, that we face as Jews. And it's something that we cannot slide out from underneath, right? There is no way to make those who hate Jews, make them stop hating us altogether, because they will change their reason depending upon whatever way the wind is blowing. All we can do is stay true to Judaism, do what Judaism asks us to do, live a good life and be tolerant and respectful of others that are different than us, and have a security guard at the door. And hope for peace in the long term.